Eleanor Marsh never believed in river legends, and her younger brother Daniel thought ghost stories were only meant to scare children when they inherited their grandfather's old house by the water. They laughed at the warnings of the villagers and ignored the whispers of something lurking beneath the surface. But on their very first night, as the river shimmered under the moonlight, Eleanor saw a pale figure rise from the water and vanish without a sound, leaving behind only a wet handprint pressed against their door. From that moment, they realized the river wasn't just water, it was waiting for them. The first time I heard the word Jalpret was when I moved into my grandfather's old house by the river. I had inherited it after his death, and though the place was quiet and away from the city, there was something unsettling about it from the very beginning. The river stretched endlessly, wide and dark, its surface almost always calm, like a black sheet of glass. At night it reflected the moon in strange shapes, never clear, always bent and distorted as though something beneath the surface refused to let the reflection settle. My grandfather used to warn people about the river. I had faint memories of him muttering warnings, telling me never to wander near the banks after sunset. But at the time I dismissed them as the ramblings of an old man trapped in his fears. Now, standing there alone in that house, those warnings began to crawl back into my thoughts. The house itself carried its own heaviness. The walls smelled faintly of damp wood, as if water had soaked into them long ago and never left. In some corners, the plaster had bubbled and cracked, leaving patterns that looked disturbingly like open eyes staring out. I told myself it was nothing more than the natural decay of an old structure, but my unease grew every night. The silence was never complete. No matter how still the air was, the river always made its presence known. A splash here, a ripple there, sometimes even the sound of dripping water echoing through the darkness when no rain had fallen in weeks. I couldn't explain it, but I never felt alone. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, I lingered by the riverbank. The air was cool, heavy with the earthy smell of wet soil. The water shimmered with faint streaks of silver from the fading light. For a long while it was only me and the sound of crickets. Then I noticed it. The surface began to ripple, not like the gentle waves made by wind, but in circular motions as though something had risen from underneath. My eyes fixed on the center of the disturbance, waiting for a fish or perhaps a floating log. What I saw instead made my body stiffen. There, in the shallows, stood a figure, a woman waist-deep in the water, her skin unnaturally pale, as if the river had drained all color from her body. Her hair was long and black, plastered to her face, dripping endlessly into the current. She did not move, but I felt her attention on me, even though I could not see her eyes. The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and in that split second she vanished. The water was empty again, leaving only widening ripples crawling toward the shore. My chest ached with panic as I stumbled back to the house. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe my imagination was playing with me, fueled by my grandfather's old warnings. Yet as I shut the front door behind me, trying to steady my breath, I froze. On the wooden doorstep, shining faintly in the dim light, was a handprint. It was large, larger than mine, pressed so deeply into the wood that water still dripped from its outline. The wood was soaked as though someone had pressed their wet hand against it only moments earlier. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed listening to every creak of the house, every faint sound drifting from the river. My mind kept replaying the sight of her pale form in the water. The silence of the house turned suffocating, and in the corners of the room I swore I saw damp shadows spreading across the walls, inching closer to me. When I finally closed my eyes, I felt as though someone was standing at the edge of the bed, dripping water onto the floor. The sound of each drop echoed inside my skull, growing louder, until I woke with a start. My room was dry, my floor untouched, but my sheets clung cold and damp against my skin as though I had been lying in water. The river never left me alone after that. Even in my dreams I found myself walking along its banks, the dark water rising higher, whispering in a voice I could not understand. And always, I would see her, sometimes half submerged, sometimes standing just beyond reach, her hair covering her face, waiting. I began to realize that my grandfather's warnings were not superstition. They were survival, but I had ignored them, and now something in the river had noticed me. When morning finally came, I staggered to the door in the pale light of dawn, hoping the daylight would banish the unease. But the handprint was still there, darker now, as though burned into the wood, and no amount of scrubbing could erase it. That was when I knew the river had left its mark on me. And whatever I had seen, it wasn't done. I tried convincing myself that what I had seen was only a trick of my mind, that the river was nothing more than water and shadows. But my thoughts were restless, and my body betrayed me. I woke every morning more exhausted than the last, my eyes heavy, my chest tight. The house seemed to feed on my unease, each room colder, each corner darker, as though the walls themselves were aware of my fear. The river hummed in the back of my mind like a memory that refused to fade, and I began to dread the approach of nightfall more than anything else. It started with the sound. At first I thought it was the wind moving through the trees, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't natural. It was a melody, soft and haunting, floating faintly across the air. It came from the direction of the river, carrying with it a rhythm that felt almost human but stretched too far, too slow, too hollow. Each night the tune grew stronger, threading into my dreams. Even when I managed to close my eyes, I would wake with the sound still echoing in my head, my ears ringing, my heart pounding against my ribs. One night the sound grew so clear that it seemed to be inside the house itself. I rose from bed, trembling, and wandered into the hallway. The floor was icy under my feet, as though the warmth had been drained out of the wood. That was when I noticed the prints. Dark, wet footprints trailing across the boards. They were narrow at the heel, long at the toe, as though made by bare feet dragging slightly with each step. My breath caught as I followed them, my skin crawling with the weight of dread. The trail led from the front door to the kitchen, and then to the window that faced the river. But there the prints stopped, as though the figure that left them had vanished into thin air. There were no returning steps, no smears, no sign of exit, only a faint puddle beneath the glass, still glistening as though fresh. I locked every window and door that night, yet I woke in the morning to find the locks undone, the wood damp with condensation. The river had risen overnight, creeping closer to the property, its surface unusually still, reflecting the house in distorted fragments. I stood staring at it, unable to shake the feeling that the reflection wasn't mine, that what stared back from beneath the water belonged to someone else. That evening the humming returned, louder, closer, wrapping around the house like a living presence. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The sound seemed to come from inside me, resonating in my chest, vibrating through my bones. My vision blurred, and when I blinked, I thought I saw a shadow standing at the far corner of the room. A thin figure, dripping wet, its head tilted toward me as if listening. But when I looked again, it was gone, leaving only a dampness spreading across the floorboards. My nights turned into long stretches of staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. I could no longer tell if I was asleep or awake, because the same images haunted me in both states. The pale woman rising from the water, her hair hanging like weeds, her lips moving silently in the shape of words I could not hear. The sound of drops falling endlessly onto the floor, soaking through, forming puddles that crawled toward the bed. My sheets remained cold, as though they had been pulled from a river before I lay down. Then came the scratching. It started faint, a low rasping at the bedroom door, like nails dragging across the wood. It grew sharper, louder, as though something was carving its way inside. My chest tightened with terror, my body frozen in place. I wanted to scream, but no sound left my throat. Slowly, trembling, I reached for the handle. The scratching stopped the instant I touched it. When I pulled the door open, the hallway beyond was empty, silent. But at my feet was a puddle, cloudy and foul-smelling, seeping into the carpet. Floating on its surface was a single strand of hair, long, black, slick with water. I stood there staring, my hand shaking, my breath short, knowing I had crossed a line I could never return from. The river was not outside anymore. It had found its way in. The villagers had begun to treat me differently. When I passed through the narrow lanes to buy food or fetch water, their eyes followed me with a quiet kind of fear. Conversations hushed when I came close, and I caught fragments of words spoken low, words that only deepened the pit in my stomach. One word in particular returned again and again, whispered with dread, Jalpret. I didn't know its meaning, but every time I heard it, the hairs on my arms rose. It felt less like a name and more like a curse, something no one wanted to speak aloud yet could not avoid. I went back to the house with their stares heavy on my back, feeling as though I was carrying their fear into my rooms along with my groceries. The silence in the house pressed down even harder now. Each night grew heavier, longer, filled with the dripping of unseen water, the faint scratches in the walls, the cold drafts that came without warning. I couldn't bear it anymore, so I decided to search for answers, hoping my grandfather might have left behind some explanation. The attic was a place I had avoided. Its ceiling was low, and the air that seeped through its cracks carried the smell of rotten mildew. Dust clung to my throat as I pulled the ladder down and climbed into the gloom. The single window up there was so coated with grime that the light barely passed through, casting a dim yellow haze across stacks of old boxes. Among them was a chest, old and scarred, its lid warped by water damage. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were books, scraps of paper, and finally a small leather journal, its cover stained and soft from moisture. I carried it down into the faint glow of a lamp and began to read. The handwriting was my grandfather's, though it had grown unsteady near the final pages. At first the entry spoke of daily life, of fishing, of repairs to the house, of loneliness, but soon the tone shifted. He wrote about the river and the way it seemed to move, even when the air was still. He described shapes beneath the surface, long arms, pale faces, glimpsed for only a second before sinking again. He spoke of a woman who came at night, her singing drifting across the water, luring him closer. She was not living, he wrote, but something that belonged to the water. He named her Jalpret. As I read further, the words became frantic, the ink darker where his hand must have pressed harder against the page. He wrote that she had once been human, drowned long ago under betrayal, left to sink beneath the river's weight. Her spirit lingered, drawn to houses near the banks, drawn to those who lived alone. Once you saw her, he said, you could not undo it. She would not stop until she claimed you. She would leave signs, footprints, water on the floor, hair where it did not belong, and she would never let you escape. The last entry made my blood run cold. It was short, shaky, almost unreadable. She comes for me tonight. The locks will not keep her out. If you find this, know that she will come for you too. I am sorry. My skin crawled as I closed the journal. That was when I heard it. A faint dripping, louder than before, coming from above. I looked up at the ceiling, at the beams darkened with moisture, at the droplets falling steadily onto the floor near my feet. But there were no pipes overhead, nothing that could explain it. The attic was dry when I left it, yet the water kept falling, drop by drop, pooling into a circle on the floorboards. I lifted the lamp and turned toward the corner of the room. That was when I froze. In the shadows, crouched low, was a figure. Thin, soaked, its limbs folded at strange angles. Long black hair hung in wet strands covering the face. But I knew she was watching me. My body locked in place, unable to move, my mind screaming at me to run while my legs refused. The lamp flickered, casting her form in and out of sight, and each time she seemed closer, the light sputtered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. In that final second before everything was swallowed by shadow, I saw her face. Pale, swollen, eyes wide and unblinking, and her mouth open to wide, gaping as though the river itself lived inside her. The last thing I heard was the sound of water rushing across the floor, moving toward me as if alive. From that night onward, I could no longer convince myself that the house was mine. I had become a guest inside it, and the true owner was something I could neither see clearly nor understand. The air felt damped no matter where I went, heavy with a smell that clung to me like rotting wood and stagnant water. My clothes, though freshly washed, always seemed cold against my skin, as if they had been dipped into the river and hung to dry in the shadows. The walls themselves seemed to weep. I would wake to find streaks of moisture running down the wallpaper, dripping silently into the floorboards, leaving stains shaped like long fingers reaching downward. Sleep became impossible. Every time I shut my eyes, her face waited for me, pale and water-swollen, lips dark and bluish, eyes stretched open with no life behind them. She hovered at the edges of my dreams, sometimes submerged, sometimes rising slowly from the depths of black water. I would wake to the sound of my own breath choking in my throat, only to discover that I was standing at the riverbank, my feet buried in wet soil, with no memory of leaving my bed. More than once I returned inside with mud clinging to my ankles, though the doors remained locked from within. The house grew increasingly hostile, as though every object inside it had turned against me. Doors creaked open on their own in the dead of night. Windows fogged with condensation even when the air outside was dry, and faint handprints slid down the glass from the other side. Sometimes I would catch glimpses in mirrors, shapes not my own moving in the reflection, blurred and hunched, dripping with water. When I leaned closer, the shapes would vanish, leaving only a faint mist pressed against the glass, as though someone had been breathing there. The night stretched endlessly, each one worse than the last. I began to hear her humming not just outside, but within the walls, a low vibration that settled into my bones. It was no longer a melody, it had turned into something like chanting, a wordless sound that pulled at me, as though calling me deeper into her world. My chest would tighten whenever it began, and sometimes I found myself answering in whispers, words I did not recognize spilling from my mouth as though I was speaking in her language. Then came the night when the river surged higher than it ever had. Rain had not fallen for weeks, yet the water climbed with steady determination, inch by inch, until it touched the edge of the porch. I tried to block it out, tried to tell myself it was only a trick of erosion, but the truth revealed itself too quickly. The water crept beneath the front door, not flowing like a natural flood but crawling, stretching across the floor in long tendrils that reached toward me. I stumbled back, horror freezing me where I stood. In the water's surface, faint and shimmering, I saw her. Her face stared up at me, pressed against the reflection as if from beneath a glass barrier. Her lips parted slowly, revealing dark water spilling from her mouth, and then she smiled. The sight of it snapped something inside me. I fled into another room, slamming the door behind me. But even there the smell of the river clung to the air, bitter and suffocating. The lights flickered and hissed, their glow dimming until the shadows thickened, and I felt her presence waiting just beyond the walls. Every sound around me grew amplified, the drip of water, the groan of wood, the faint scrape of something dragging across the floor. I pressed my hands over my ears, desperate to shut it all out, but the sound only grew louder inside me. A whisper now, close, intimate, like breath against my skin. I did not understand the words, yet I knew their meaning. She was patient. She would wait. When I finally gathered enough courage to open the door again, the water was gone. The floor was dry, the air strangely still, as though nothing had ever happened. But I could not shake what I had seen in the reflection of that crawling water. Her face was no longer distant, no longer reaching from the river alone. She was inside now. Inside the house, inside me, watching, waiting. and when I closed my eyes that night, I felt her lips almost touch my ear, humming a tune that was no longer outside but deep within the hollow of my skull. I no longer knew how many nights had passed. The river had stolen my sense of time, stretching each hour into something endless, a slow drowning in silence and shadows. The house was sinking into her grasp. Room by room, the river crept in, not with rushing floods but with a quiet invasion. First the cellar, then the hallway, then the kitchen, all of them swallowed by water that never receded. Furniture floated aimlessly in dark corners. Doors warped and swelled, refusing to close. The air inside was thick with the stench of rot, like wet earth mixed with something sweeter, something almost like decay. I avoided the submerged rooms, but every night the water came closer, rising up the stairs, seeking me. The humming never left me. It had grown constant, no longer a sound that drifted from the river but a voice that lived inside the walls. Sometimes it sounded distant, like a song carried by wind, but other times it was right beside me, as if someone pressed their mouth to my ear. My body ached from sleeplessness. My skin felt thin, as though the dampness had soaked into me, making me something less than human. When I looked at my reflection, I thought I saw a faint pallor spreading across my face. My eyes hollow, my lips darker than they should be. I tried to leave. I stumbled out into the village at dawn, desperate for help, desperate for anyone to acknowledge what was happening, but their doors closed before I reached them. Their eyes looked through me as if I were already lost. They whispered that word again, Jalpret, but would not explain. I realized then that they knew. They had always known. Once she chose you, no one could save you. The river was patient. The spirit was eternal. And I was only a body waiting to be claimed. I returned to the house with dread pressing against my chest like a weight. My final refuge was the upstairs room, the last dry place in the house. I barred the door, though I knew it would not matter. The floor beneath me was damp, a thin sheen of moisture spreading wider every hour. The smell of mud and stagnant water clung to every breath I took. In the silence between the humming, I heard the house groan as though it too were alive, as though the river had filled its bones. The journal lay open beside me, the pages warped, the ink smudged into illegible stains. But one page stood out, written in a hand that was not my grandfather's. The letters were shaky, black with wetness, and though I had no memory of writing them, the words were mine. They spoke of surrender, of belonging, of how once the river marked you, there was no turning back. The entry ended with a sentence that made my skin crawl. When the river takes me, another will come. She will wait, as she always has. The sound of rushing water came then, faint but growing, a steady climb up the staircase. I sat frozen, listening as it lapped against each step. The door shuddered softly with the weight of it pressing closer, and I knew it was only a matter of moments before the last room was taken. My breath came shallow, my hands trembling against the soaked wood of the desk. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The humming rose above the rushing sound, louder than ever, filling the room until my head throbbed. It was no longer a melody. It was a command, ancient and inescapable. I closed my eyes and felt the temperature drop, a chill that sank into my bones. My body shivered, but I could not move. It was as though invisible hands held me in place. When I finally forced my eyes open, the room was no longer empty. In the puddle forming at my feet, her reflection rippled up at me, not smiling now but staring, her eyes wide and endless, her hair spreading in strands like black weeds. The water climbed higher, soaking into my legs, dragging me downward though the floor should have been solid. I reached for the desk, for the walls, for anything, but my hands only met wet air. The last sound I heard was not my own breath, not the creak of wood, but the steady whisper of her voice, speaking in words that bubbled and gurgled like the river itself. I could not understand them, but I knew their meaning. She was behind me. She had always been behind me. And when the water closed over my head, I realized the truth my grandfather had left unsaid. The house was never cursed. It was only waiting. The Jalpret does not haunt a place. She waits for people. And now she waits for you.